Elias had lived in solitude for nearly a decade. His cabin nestled deep in the Alaskan wilderness, where the only company he had was the wind howling through the pines and the crackle of his fireplace. His days were spent hunting, trapping, and surviving the ruthless winters that swallowed everything in ice and silence. He had long since grown used to the isolation, welcoming it even after the loss of his wife and child in a tragic accident that had driven him away from the world. But on one bitterly cold morning, as he trudged through the knee-deep snow searching for fresh tracks, he saw something unusual in the distance. A small mound, dark against the white landscape, unmoving. At first, he thought it was a fallen branch or a rock peeking out from the snow. But as he drew closer, he realized it was something else entirely. A tiny bear cub, half buried in the frost, its frail body shivering violently. The sight of it stirred something in him, a pang of emotion he had long buried beneath years of self-imposed exile. He hesitated, knowing full well that the mother could be nearby, ready to defend her offspring. But after scanning the area, he saw no tracks, no signs of a mother bear anywhere. The cub was alone, abandoned or orphaned, and it was dying. Elias knelt beside it, gently brushing the snow off its tiny body, his gloved hand feeling the rapid but weakening rise and fall of its breath. The cub's fur was soaked, its tiny limbs stiff with cold, and its eyes, barely open, held a dullness that signaled the approach of death. He could walk away, leave nature to take its course, let the weak perish as the wild dictated. But something inside him, something deep and instinctive, refused to let that happen. Without another thought, he unbuttoned his thick coat, scooped the cub into his arms, and pressed it against his chest, shielding it from the relentless cold. The cub whimpered softly, its body barely responsive, as he turned back toward his cabin, his boots crunching through the frozen ground with urgency. The storm was worsening, the wind biting into his exposed skin. But Elias pushed forward, knowing that if he didn't get the cub to warm soon, it wouldn't make it. By the time he reached the cabin, his fingers were numb, his breath coming out in thick clouds as he shouldered open the heavy wooden door, shutting out the blizzard that had begun to rage outside. Inside, the fire still burned, its heat a welcome relief as he hurried to his old rocking chair by the hearth. Carefully, he unwrapped the bundle of fur in his arms and set the cub down on a thick woolen blanket, rubbing its tiny paws between his hands to stimulate circulation. The cub let out a faint, pitiful cry, barely more than a whisper, and Elias felt his heart tighten. He knew nothing about nursing a bear back to health, but he knew warmth was its only chance. He grabbed another blanket, wrapping it snugly around the fragile body, before rising to prepare anything that might help. He had no milk, nothing a cub might drink, but he remembered an old trick from a trapper he'd met years ago: warm water mixed with honey, a temporary substitute. He heated some water over the fire, added the last of his honey to it, and carefully dribbled a few drops onto the cub's lips. At first, it didn't react, its body too weak, but after a moment, its tiny pink tongue flicked out, tasting the sweetness. Encouraged, Elias continued, coaxing it to drink little by little. Minutes stretched into an hour, and slowly, the cub's breathing steadied, its shivers less violent. He watched it with a strange sense of attachment, as if he were witnessing something fragile and precious fight its way back to life. The storm raged on outside, the wind screaming against the cabin walls, but inside, a quiet determination filled the air. Elias sat beside the cub, watching over it like a guardian, wondering what he had just gotten himself into. He had spent years pushing the world away, convinced he had nothing left to give. But now, in the glow of the firelight, with a helpless creature relying on him for survival, he felt something he hadn't in a long time: purpose. The storm had passed by morning, leaving behind a world buried in pristine white. The cabin was still, save for the occasional pop from the fireplace, its embers casting a soft glow across the wooden walls. Elias sat in his rocking chair, his gaze fixed on the small bundle of fur nestled within the thick blankets near the hearth. The cub had survived the night, though its breathing remained slow and shallow. He hadn't slept, keeping watch over the fragile creature, ensuring the warmth of the fire never faltered. As the first rays of dawn seeped through the frost-lined windows, the cub stirred. Its small body shifted beneath the blankets, and with great effort, its eyes fluttered open. Elias watched as the tiny bear, no longer just a dying thing in the snow, blinked up at him with glassy, uncertain eyes. It tried to move, its limbs weak and unsteady, before collapsing again, exhausted from the mere attempt. "You're a stubborn one," Elias muttered, leaning forward to offer the last of the honey water mixture. The cub sniffed at it before lapping up a few drops, its tiny tongue working sluggishly but with newfound strength. The next few days were touch and go. The cub remained weak, and Elias did everything he could to nurse it back to health. He fed it what little he could. Small portions of softened bread soaked in goat's milk from his dwindling supply, bits of cooked fish he managed to catch through the frozen lake nearby. He massaged its legs to restore circulation, wrapped it in layers of warmth, and ensured it never spent a second in the cold. Slowly, it began to improve. The once lifeless creature started responding to his touch, its whimpers becoming stronger, its body no longer limp and unresponsive. By the end of the week, the cub attempted to stand on its own. It was wobbly, its legs trembling under the weight of its own tiny frame, but determination burned in its dark eyes. Elias watched as it took a shaky step forward before tumbling onto its belly with a huff. A faint chuckle escaped him, a sound he hadn't heard from himself in years. "You've got spirit," he said, leaning down to lift the cub back up. "Coda, that's what I'll call you." The name felt right. Strong but simple, fitting for the small survivor now growing under his care. Coda's progress was slow but steady. As weeks turned into months, the cub grew stronger, its legs more stable, its body filling out from the nutrition Elias provided. It became playful, exploring the cabin with newfound curiosity, knocking over furniture, pawing at Elias's boots whenever he sat still for too long. The once dying creature had transformed into a mischievous ball of energy, and despite himself, Elias couldn't help but grow attached. The loneliness that had once suffocated him felt distant now. His days, once spent in quiet isolation, were now filled with the sounds of Coda's playful growls, the thumping of his paws against the wooden floor, the occasional yelp as he tumbled over something too big for his growing frame. Elias taught Coda how to fish, bringing him to the edge of the frozen lake, where they would sit for hours, waiting for the right moment to strike. He showed him how to track scents, leading him through the dense forest, pointing out the signs of prey in the snow. It became clear that Coda was intelligent, learning quickly, his instincts sharp despite being raised by human hands. But as Coda grew, so did the challenges. At 6 months, he was no longer a small, helpless cub. His strength had multiplied, his body larger than an average dog, his claws sharper. He was still playful, still affectionate, but Elias could feel the shift. One evening, as he prepared dinner, Coda playfully pawed at his back, as he often did, but this time the force sent Elias stumbling forward, nearly knocking the pot from the stove. The cub, unaware of his own strength, simply looked up at him, his head tilted in innocent curiosity. Elias sighed, ruffling Coda's thickening fur. "You don't know your own power, do you?" By the time Coda reached a year old, he was massive, his one small frame now towering over Elias when he stood on his hind legs. Though he remained loyal, the wildness in him was undeniable. He was no longer just a cub. He was a bear, a predator, something that instinctively belonged to the wilderness. Elias knew it was only a matter of time before he would have to make a decision. One evening, as they sat by the lake, Elias watched Coda sniff the air, his body tense, ears perked, sensing something unseen. A moment later, he was gone, bounding into the trees with powerful strides. Elias didn't chase after him. He knew what this meant. Coda had caught the scent of something wild, something natural. The pull of his instincts was stronger than the bond they had built. Hours passed before Coda returned, his fur damp, his eyes glowing with excitement. He had hunted. He had tasted what it meant to be a bear in the wild. Elias exhaled, leaning back against a tree trunk, watching the sun dip below the horizon. He had known this day would come, but it didn't make it any easier. Kota was no longer just his companion. He was something beyond his control. The realization left a heavy weight in his chest. He had saved Kota's life once, but soon he would have to let him go. But fate had other plans. One night, as Elias sat in his cabin, a sound in the distance caught his attention, a distant rumbling, unnatural, foreign to the wilderness. He rose, grabbing his rifle, stepping onto the porch. The air was still, but then he saw it. Lights in the distance, moving through the trees. Poachers. They had come before, scouring the land for fur, for trophies, for anything they could take and sell. But now, with Kota fully grown, Elias knew exactly what they were after. A sick feeling coiled in his stomach. Kota wasn't just a cub anymore. He was a prize, and they wouldn't stop until they had him. The air was thick with the scent of pine and smoke as Elias crouched near the edge of his cabin's porch, rifle gripped tightly in his hands. The distant glow of headlights moved through the trees, slow and methodical, like a predator stalking its prey. He had seen signs of poachers before. Tracks in the snow, missing game, the occasional abandoned carcass stripped of fur and left to rot. But this was different. They were coming directly toward his land, and that meant only one thing. They had seen Kota. Elias's mind raced. He had always known this day would come. Raising a wild bear in secret was never something that could last forever, but he had hoped, foolishly perhaps, that the wilderness would keep their bond hidden from prying eyes. But Kota had grown. He had roamed further, left deeper tracks, made his presence known. And now, men who saw him as nothing more than a trophy were closing in. A rustling in the underbrush made Elias turn sharply, heart pounding. Kota was there, standing at the tree-lean, his massive silhouette barely visible in the moonlight. His thick fur blended into the darkness. His deep brown eyes locked onto Elias with an intensity that sent a shiver down his spine. "Kota," Elias whispered, barely a breath. The bear sniffed the air, sensing the same danger Elias did. Then came the first gunshot. It cracked through the silence like a bolt of lightning, splitting the night in two. Elias dropped to his stomach as the bullet slammed into the side of his cabin, splintering wood. Kota reared onto his hind legs, letting out a deep, guttural growl that sent a wave of dread rolling through Elias's chest. They had seen him. Elias cursed under his breath, rolling onto his side as he aimed his rifle toward the approaching headlights. His pulse roared in his ears as he steadied his breath, his finger hovering over the trigger. He had spent years avoiding violence, living off the land in solitude, keeping his distance from the world of men. But now, men had come to take what was his. Another shot rang out. This one missed its mark, whizzing past Elias's shoulder and burying itself into a tree behind him. He took aim and fired. His shot found its target, a tire, sending one of the approaching vehicles skidding sideways into the snow. Shouts erupted in the distance. Elias could hear them now, the voices of at least 3 men, cursing as they scrambled for cover. "Kota, go!" Elias hissed, but the bear didn't move. Instead, he stood his ground, muscles tensed, his massive form radiating tension. Elias fired again, forcing one of the poachers to duck behind a tree. The other 2 retaliated, their shots scattering across the clearing, ricocheting off rocks and wood. The smell of gunpowder burned in Elias's nostrils as he reloaded. And then Kota moved. With a deafening roar, the bear launched forward, thundering through the snow with terrifying speed. The poachers barely had time to react before Kota was upon them. Elias heard the sickening crunch of bone, the screams of men who had never expected their prey to fight back. He didn't watch, he couldn't. Instead, he pushed forward, moving between trees, staying low as he flanked their position. One of the poachers turned toward him, raising his rifle. Elias fired first, The man crumpled to the ground with a cry, his gun slipping from his hands. The remaining shooter took one look at the carnage before turning to flee, disappearing into the trees, his shouts fading into the night. Then, silence. Elias stood in the snow, breath heavy, chest rising and falling with the weight of what had just happened. His rifle hung loosely in his grip, his hands numb from the cold and adrenaline. Slowly he turned. Kota stood in the clearing, his massive frame illuminated by the moonlight. Blood stained his fur, his jaws dripping crimson. His sides heaved with exertion, his dark eyes locked onto Elias. For the first time since the night he had saved him, Elias felt a sliver of fear. Kota was no longer a cub. He was no longer the helpless creature Elias had nursed back to health. He was a predator, and he had just killed for the first time. Elias took a step forward. Kota's ears twitched. The bear's breath came in heavy puffs, his nostrils flaring. The wildness in him was undeniable now, raw and untamed. Then something shifted. Kota let out a low, rumbling sound, a deep exhale, almost a sigh. His shoulders relaxed, the tension melting from his body. He took a step toward Elias, then another, his massive paws pressing into the snow. Elias swallowed. "You saved my life," he murmured. Kota blinked, then nudged Elias's shoulder with his blood-streaked snout. The gesture was almost gentle, as if, despite everything, despite the carnage and the violence, some part of the bond they had built still remained. Elias exhaled shakily, reaching out. His fingers brushed against Kota's thick fur, and the bear rumbled in response. The threat was gone. The poachers had been dealt with, but the night had changed everything. Elias knew then that he could no longer keep Kota here. He had raised him, loved him, taught him, but Kota wasn't meant for this life. He wasn't a pet. He wasn't a companion. He was a force of nature, something wild and untamable. And tonight, he had proven it. The realization was a knife to the gut. Elias had spent years building a life with Kota, convincing himself that they could exist together, that the wilderness could be shared. But the truth had been there all along. One day, Kota would have to leave, and that day had come. The next morning, Elias packed what little he could, a few supplies, a rope he knew he wouldn't need, an old knife he had once considered bringing but now left behind. Kota stood at the edge of the forest, watching him. Elias swallowed hard. He had taken Kota in, saved his life when he had been a helpless cub. But now, it was Kota's turn to return to the wild. He stepped forward and placed a hand against Kota's thick fur one last time. "Go on," he said softly. "You're ready." Kota stared at him for a long moment, then let out a deep, huffing breath. And then he turned. Elias watched as the bear moved into the trees, his massive frame disappearing between the pines. He didn't stop. He didn't look back. The cabin felt emptier than it ever had before. Elias stood there for a long time, listening to the silence of the forest. He had saved Kota's life once, and Kota had repaid the debt in blood. But their journey together had ended. He was alone again. But for the first time in years, the loneliness didn't feel so unbearable. Because somewhere, deep in the wilderness, a bear roamed free, a bear who had once been a dying cub in the snow. And that was enough.